Belarus on fire. Mutiny and protests erupt after Putin turns on Lukashenko. Hello everyone, welcome back to the World Conflict Monitor channel. Please subscribe to my channel so you never miss our deep dives into world events. Today, we are looking at a shocking development that has set Belarus ablaze both politically and socially. For years, Alexander Lukashenko has been described as Europe's last dictator, holding on to power through manipulation, repression, and loyalty from Moscow. But now, the ground under him is shaking. Putin, who once stood as his strongest ally, seems to be turning against him, and the people of Belarus, long suffocated by fear, are erupting into mutiny and protest. What happens when a leader who survived decades of opposition suddenly faces betrayal from his biggest sponsor? And what does it mean for the wider geopolitical battlefield between Russia, NATO, and Ukraine? Let's break it down. The story begins with Belarus, a landlocked nation historically tied to Russia both economically and militarily. For decades, Lukashenko survived not because of his popularity, but because of Moscow's political and financial backing. However, recent cracks have emerged in this once solid alliance. As Russia bleeds resources in its war against Ukraine, Putin has begun re-evaluating which allies are worth sustaining. Lukashenko, often demanding more than he gives, has now become a burden rather than a partner. Reports from intelligence circles suggest that the Kremlin is quietly encouraging elements within Belarus, military officers, political elites, and even sections of the security apparatus, to think about life beyond Lukashenko. That shift has lit the spark of unrest, and now protests and signs of mutiny are spreading like wildfire. From the outside, or the exterior, Belarus is presenting a picture of chaos and cracks in its power structure. Crowds of protesters have flooded streets in Minsk, Gomel, and other major cities. They carry national flags, chant anti-Lukashenko slogans, and openly call for freedom from both Lukashenko and Russian domination. The world sees this exterior image of Belarus as one of a nation breaking apart, caught between dictatorship and people power. The state security forces, once seen as ironclad, are beginning to hesitate, with reports of defections and refusals to suppress protesters. On the borders, Poland and Lithuania watch nervously, preparing for the possibility that instability could spill into the European Union. From this external viewpoint, Belarus is now on fire, literally and symbolically, sending shockwaves across the continent. But inside Belarus, in the interior, the story looks more fragile and personal. The people have lived under fear for decades, where even a whisper against the government could lead to arrest or disappearance. Now, the interior reality is shifting. Families are divided, with some clinging to the old system for survival, while others are pushing into the streets demanding change. In the military barracks, junior officers whisper about mutiny, questioning why they should protect a leader abandoned by his own ally in Moscow. The once tight-knit elite that surrounded Lukashenko is fracturing, as businessmen and politicians sense the end of his reign. Inside homes and workplaces, people feel both hope and fear, hope for freedom, and fear of violent backlash. The interior of Belarus is no longer one of silence, but of voices rising against oppression. When we look at performance, Lukashenko's regime has entered a stage of clear dysfunction. For years, his performance as a ruler was measured not in democratic legitimacy, but in how well he could balance between Russia and the West, repress his population, and keep his economy afloat through subsidies. That performance is now collapsing. His alignment with Russia in the war against Ukraine has drained Belarus of stability. Sanctions have crippled its economy, inflation is hurting everyday citizens, and industries that once thrived on trade with Europe have stalled. In terms of political performance, Lukashenko is failing to deliver security or prosperity. Even his once loyal military is underperforming, with units hesitant to follow orders and commanders unsure whom to trust. The machinery of dictatorship that once seemed unshakable is grinding to a halt, leaving gaps that protests and mutiny are now exploiting. Safety features, if we think of them in the political sense, refer to the mechanisms a regime uses to protect itself. Lukashenko relied heavily on three safety features: the loyalty of his KGB-style security services, the unwavering support of Russia, and the fear instilled in his population. All three are eroding. His security services are stretched thin, with reports of officers refusing orders or even joining protesters. Russia's support, once his greatest shield, is now wavering, with Putin possibly preparing to replace him or use Belarus as a pawn without him. And fear among the population has been replaced by anger and boldness. When a regime loses its safety features, it becomes exposed, and that is exactly the position Lukashenko now finds himself in. The protests are testing the limits of his power, and his options for restoring control are shrinking by the day. The unique selling points of this crisis lie in its geopolitical significance. Unlike other uprisings, Belarus is not just a domestic issue, it is a chessboard piece in the larger war between Russia and the West. Belarus borders NATO countries, serves as a staging ground for Russian troops, and acts as a buffer zone between Moscow and Europe. What makes this crisis unique is that for the first time in decades, the possibility of Belarus slipping out of Russia's orbit is real. If Lukashenko falls and a more Western-leaning leadership takes charge, Russia loses a vital ally and its strategic foothold in Europe. On the other hand, if Putin intervenes militarily to preserve his grip, the conflict could escalate into a larger confrontation with NATO. This uniqueness makes the crisis in Belarus more than just a national rebellion, it becomes a trigger point for international power struggles. When we talk about price, it is measured in human cost, economic collapse, and geopolitical risk. For the people of Belarus, the price has already been high: years of repression, thousands of political prisoners, and now blood on the streets as clashes erupt between protesters and security forces. Economically, the sanctions and instability are driving Belarus into deeper poverty, with its industries collapsing and trade routes closing. For Russia, the price of abandoning Lukashenko is losing influence, but the price of supporting him is pouring more resources into an unstable regime while fighting a draining war in Ukraine. For the West, the price comes in managing the instability on their borders, potential refugee flows, and the risk of direct confrontation with Moscow. The crisis in Belarus is not free for anyone, it comes at a heavy cost that each actor must calculate carefully. In conclusion, Belarus is standing at the edge of transformation. The long reign of Alexander Lukashenko, sustained by repression and Russian backing, is facing its greatest threat yet. Putin's apparent turn against him has emboldened both elites and ordinary citizens, sparking mutiny and protests that are shaking the regime. From the exterior, the world sees a nation in flames; from the interior, citizens feel both hope and fear. The performance of the regime has collapsed, its safety features are failing, and its unique geopolitical position makes this crisis more than just a domestic matter. The price is heavy, paid in lives, economy, and international stability, but the possibility of change is real. Will Belarus finally break free from dictatorship, or will it become the next battlefield in Putin's struggle to maintain control over his crumbling empire? Only time will tell, but one thing is clear: the fire in Belarus is burning brighter than ever, and the world cannot look away.